Hey everybody, I'm back with another college football video. It's been a long time since I've done one of these. During the 2020 season, I, like everyone listening to this, was dealing with the effects of a global pandemic and worries about going out and having to stay home and quarantining and getting tested and all of that stuff. College football was also affected by the pandemic in numerous ways, from controversies over what conferences were going to play and what ones weren't, cancellations because of COVID outbreaks, individual players opting out because they wanted to be safe and not play, demands being made by groups of players in various conferences like the Big Ten and the Pac-12 for demands they wanted met because they saw an opportunity for change in how college football is organized and run due to the global pandemic, due to COVID-19, and all sorts of different things going on. No fans in the stadium, so the games were a bit on the weird side, all that type of stuff. Now, however, that we have a series of vaccines, that vaccine rollouts are taking place from coast to coast, albeit more slowly than many of us would like. I have not heard any talk about anything odd happening with this coming 2021 football season. There's been no talk about conferences not playing. There's been no talk about players opting out, at least as far as I've heard. There's been no talk of teams opting out, excuse me, or anything like that. So it's time now to use the offseason to delve into some issues dealing with college football and to get pumped for a full and unencumbered college football season for later this year. And the first thing that I want to look at is schedules are being released for teams across the country, and I want to dive into a certain number of schedules and a few games on each. I want to look at 7 schedules in this video, one each for the 5 champions of the Power 5 conferences, the Big Ten, the ACC, the SEC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12, as well as the 2 main schools in my home state of Michigan. That's the Michigan Wolverines and the Michigan State Spartans. I'm not going to go through every single game of every single schedule because I don't want to totally bore you, but every schedule has some very interesting matchups that we can look at right now. At least on paper, those matchups are interesting. We'll see what happens when they actually begin playing the games. So first up, let's start in my neck of the woods with the Big Ten. And of course, the Big Ten champion is, unfortunately, if you're from the state of Michigan, as I am, the Ohio State Buckeyes. There's 3 games on the schedule that, at least, again, the caveat for all of these schedules is on paper. At least the game seems interesting. Is in week 2, they are home against the Oregon Ducks, the champs coming out of the Pac-12. They were supposed to play Oregon in Eugene, Oregon last year, but they had canceled that game when it was determined initially that the Big Ten wasn't going to play football at all. And then the Pac-12 made the same decision. But then once they started looking like they were gearing up for football, they were clearly going to go conference only. So those non-conference games were just totally off the table. Now, though, they get to actually play that, and it's beneficial for Ohio State because it's a home and home, but they didn't have to go across the country to Eugene, but the Ducks have to go across the country to Columbus. So that game's on September 11th. That should be a promising game. The next one is in October on the 23rd. They're at Indiana. Last year, the Indiana Hoosiers were a strong team. They won a lot of games, and they played Ohio State to within an inch of their lives. Indiana has given Ohio State problems in the last decade or so, where the games have been mostly won by the Buckeyes, but it hasn't been easy. There were, I think, a couple of overtime victories for Ohio State in there, a couple of victories that were much, much closer than some of the spreads were initially indicating the game would be. So Indiana has always been, has at least recently, been a tough out for the Ohio State Buckeyes. And now they've got an even better team than they've had recently. Ohio State has lost Justin Fields to the NFL. He's with the Chicago Bears now. They've lost a few defensive pieces as well to the draft. So it will be interesting to see if the team that went to a national championship game last year can simply reload and get back on another national championship run, or if Indiana can this time in their home stadium, if they can get them and spoil those chances even at a Big Ten championship game. And then lastly, as always, there's the rivalry game. They're at Michigan on November 27th. Now, last year, Michigan wasn't any good. They were a terrible team last year. And under the Jim Harbaugh era, except for one game that went into overtime, Michigan's pretty much gotten beat down by the Buckeyes. We'll have to see if Michigan can rebound this year and actually play good football and be competitive in more games than they were. But even if they are, your gut feeling tells you that it's probably not going to end well for the Wolverines again this year. Although, again, Ohio State's lost a number of pieces. But does that mean that they're going to be in a, quote, rebuilding year? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to see what happens when they actually play the games on the field as opposed to on pieces of paper that some rando jackass is doing videos for on his YouTube channel. Let's move on to the aforementioned Pac-12 champ, the Oregon Ducks. They were in the Pac-12 championship game last year because the team from the Pac-12 North that was supposed to go to the Pac-12 championship game, the Washington Huskies, had a COVID outbreak at the end of the season and had to pull out. So Oregon gets slotted in. They went up against undefeated USC and ended up beating them and won another Pac-12 championship. I'm sure USC was very unhappy about that whole scenario. But so they're coming back into a full season this year. They have the game in week 2 against the aforementioned Ohio State Buckeyes. It's in Columbus, so they have to cross the country to go and play that game. They've also got a main game against a Pac-12 North rival in the Washington Huskies, the aforementioned Huskies. That takes place in Seattle on November 6th. I don't know if you can argue that Washington's like upset that they didn't get to go to the Pac-12 championship game. Maybe, but that anger is not really appropriately directed at Oregon because it's not like Oregon did some fancy duck magic and gave COVID to Washington or anything like that. But I mean, maybe they'll use something like that as motivation. Maybe they'll say, we should have been the Pac-12 champs last year, not Oregon, and they can use it to motivate themselves. But Washington and Oregon has been a very good game to watch in the Pac-12 for years now. And I would imagine and hope that this one will be no exception to that. And then 2 weeks later, on November 20th, they are at Utah. Utah's been a strong Pac-12 team. Last year, not so much. They lost a lot of good players the previous year to the NFL draft and to graduation. This year, though, maybe they'll rebound. Their coach, Kyle Whittingham, is a very good coach. I like him. I like the Utah Utes. We'll see if that game ends up living up to the billing that it may end up getting if both Oregon and Utah prove to be strong teams in the Pac-12 this season. Oregon's got a tough stretch of games coming to the end of the season. They're at Washington, as I just mentioned, on November 6th. They've got a home game against Washington State on the 13th. Then they're at Utah on the 20th. Then the next season is the in-state rivalry against Oregon State. So Oregon's got a tough stretch of games right at the end of the season. Colorado's in there as well. That's nothing to sleep on. So Oregon doesn't necessarily have a cakewalk through the Pac-12 schedule this upcoming season. Let's move completely across the country from the Pacific Coast to the Atlantic Coast, and let's go to the ACC and its champ, the Lsu Tigers. They have one of, if not the biggest game, certainly of week 1, but of probably the first half of the entire college football season. They're playing the Georgia Bulldogs in week 1, and I'm already getting like goosebumps on my arms thinking about this game and how awesome this is going to be. Clemson is going to be an interesting one to watch because the Trevor Lawrence era has ended. He is with the Jacksonville Jaguars now, and Urban Meyer, Travis Etienne, their stud running back, he's gone to the NFL now. Other good players that they had are also gone to the NFL. Some have probably cycled out to graduation. Although I think Clemson was relatively a young team, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think they had a lot of juniors and sophomores on their team last year trying to make up for a lot of losses the previous year to the NFL. So now we have a new quarterback they're breaking in. He's a 5-star kid, and my sincerest apologies, but I do not know how to pronounce the young man's name, so I'm not going to insult him by even trying to pronounce it and butchering it. And like he's going to see this YouTube video anyways. But they're breaking in a new quarterback this season. He got in a couple of games last year when Trevor Lawrence was injured, which is good. He started the game that they played and lost during the regular season against Notre Dame, but he did well in that game. Not awesome, but he did well for a true freshman who was starting a game and had to come in on relatively short notice and prep in the middle of a season against a big-time opponent in the Fighting Irish. But can Clemson simply reload and make up for the embarrassing semifinal loss that they suffered at the hands of Ohio State in last year's college football playoff? And they're not making it easy on themselves by starting out the game against the Georgia Bulldogs, a traditional SEC powerhouse. Georgia has its own issues, though. They had quarterback issues last season. They were trying to work out if they were going to go with this guy, Stetson Bennett IV. I mean, what a name, right? I mean, that sounds like he comes from old, like, plantation-era money is what it sounds like. My name is Stetson Bennett IV. That's what that sounds like. I don't know if that's really true about the kid, but his name makes it sound like it's true, doesn't it? But then they had a transfer from USC named JT Daniels, who everybody wanted him to get in, but he was injured when he transferred, and there were questions about why he wasn't getting in and why is this injury seem like it's lasting for so long. He eventually did get in to a few games at the end of the season. So Georgia's not necessarily entirely put together at this point. They struggled a bit last year, but they're still a good team. They're still a powerhouse in the SEC. And so that's a neutral site game because it's being played in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is right on the border with South Carolina, Clemson's home state. And so obviously it's much easier for fans to get from Clemson or from the surrounding area of South Carolina than it is from folks in Georgia. Although, if I've learned one thing about college football, it's that Georgia fans travel. If you remember a few years ago when Georgia went to South Bend to play Notre Dame in the beginning of the season, those Notre Dame fans were absolutely put to shame by the Georgia Bulldog fans who invaded their stadium with the UGA chants prior to kickoff. If I was a Notre Dame fan in that moment, I would be embarrassed that I got outshouted in my own damn stadium. But that promises, or at least on paper, again, the usual caveat here, promises to be a heck of a game right to open the gates in the season. That's almost certainly going to be the primetime game, probably on ABC with, Fowler and Herbstreit, the A-team, doing the commentary. The rest of Clemson's schedule, though, doesn't look great in terms of, incredibly competitive games. They avoid, because Notre Dame only jumped into the ACC for last year because of COVID, so they're no longer in the ACC this coming year. So they're not playing Notre Dame during the regular season. They get, I'm going to say, lucky in that they don't have to play North Carolina. A lot of people are high on the Tar Heels under Mac Brown this season. They played Clemson really close the last time, but they don't have to play him in the regular season this time. So luckily for Clemson, they escaped that potential trap. So I've marked down 2 road games that might potentially be problematic for Clemson, depending on how well their new quarterback and their new starting running back adjust and perform now that the spotlight's fully on them. They're at NC State on September 25th. North Carolina State's not a great team. They're a nice team. But in recent years, sometimes they can play Clemson tough. And it's at North Carolina State. So it gives them a bit of an advantage. And then at Pitt on October 23rd. Again, Pitt's had a few chances. And I think once in the recent 5 to 8 years, they've actually gotten Clemson. So, but those are kind of shaky picks for some potentially troubling games for the Clemson Tigers. Their schedule on the whole looks like it's relatively easy, unless there's some other team who's on their schedule who just has the season of seasons and can pull off a major upset. Let's proceed a bit south and go to the SEC with SEC and national champion Alabama. The Crimson Tide have a number of really tough games on their schedule. They do not have a cakewalk this year. If they're able to get through this schedule unscathed, that's going to be one hell of a coaching job from Coach Nick Saban. Starting quarterback Mac Jones is gone. Wide receivers Devontae Smith, Heisman Trophy winner, and Jalen Waddle are gone. Running back Najee Harris is gone. They've lost, I think they had 9 players drafted in the NFL draft this past April, which is a record for the most players drafted from one team. So they lost a lot of pieces from the national championship team. Same thing with that I said about Clemson and then I said about OSU. Can they simply reload? Or is this going to be kind of a down year for the Crimson Tide where they're going to lose a few games, maybe go 9-3, which is going to make everybody in Alabama other than those Auburn fans go absolutely crazy? Or can Nick Saban pull another magical rabbit out of his hat and have a great season with the talent that he's got? So let's look at some of the games they've got on their schedule. This is a tough schedule. They are opening the season against Miami, against the Hurricanes in a neutral site game. They're playing in Atlanta on September 4th. Miami isn't a great team, but they're a good team. They're a nice team. They've had a down year or two, but they have potential to be some team that can compete in the ACC. Then 2 weeks later, the Crimson Tide roll into the Swamp. They're at Florida. Florida has lost quarterback Kyle Trask to the NFL. They lost stud tight end Kyle Pitts to the NFL. They lost one of their top receivers to the NFL. So now Florida has to reload a bit as well. And there's been some questions about Florida head coach Dan Mullen and whether or not he might take an offer for the NFL coming up this offseason and leave Florida for, I don't want to say necessarily greener pastures, but probably literally greener pastures, perhaps. So there's some questions surrounding the Florida program going on right now that have yet to be answered. But it still doesn't mean that that's going to be an easy game for Alabama to just roll into. Then a couple of weeks later, they're at Texas A&M. Last season, Texas A&M had a top 5 offensive line and a top 5 defensive line. They're, I think, the only team in the nation that had that last season. A lot of people are very high on Texas A&M. I don't know what their quarterback situation is because Kellen Mond is gone. But I have a lot of people like Jimbo Fisher, their head coach, and what he's been doing there. Texas A&M has been recruiting very well. Some pundits say now they are the top recruiting school in Texas, supplanting the University of Texas for that honor. So that's not going to be an easy game. And College Station is not an easy place to go in and win a game. There's over 100,000 people who are in the stands. And when Alabama's coming to town, they are going to be going out of their minds rooting on their hometown Aggies for that one. Excuse me. Then fast forward about 3 more weeks, and then Alabama is home for LSU. This is not the Joe Burrow national champion LSU Tigers any longer, but they got not necessarily back on track during the COVID year, but they finished the season strong and won a few games in a row. They had kind of a carousel of quarterbacks because one of the guys got hurt and one of them just didn't perform. I believe they've got former NFL quarterback Brad Johnson's son as one of their stable of quarterbacks who's on the roster now. He won a couple of games for them last season. It looked like they were starting to right the ship and they were getting some momentum going. We'll see if that carries over and we'll see how LSU does. But that's always a game that's kind of a heated rivalry because of the history between the two teams. And then finally, a few weeks after that, is the Iron Bowl, where they're at Auburn. And that is always a heated rivalry. That is always a big-time game. Auburn's got a new head coach because Gus Malzahn got let go. He is at Central Florida now. So we'll see what changes. We'll see if Auburn quarterback Bo Nix can actually take the next step and become a good quarterback. He had a good freshman season, a lackluster sophomore season during the COVID year. We'll see if he's able to adjust to a new head coach and perhaps a new system that's going to be implemented. But just the nature of that rivalry almost always makes for good Iron Bowls between Auburn and between Alabama. Let's move west and a little bit north and look at the Big 12 and their champion, Oklahoma. They've got a few games that are potentially troublesome on their schedule. The first game I want to look at is in October. On October 2nd, they're at Kansas State. Kansas State, I believe for the first time ever, has beaten Oklahoma in 2 consecutive seasons. They beat them at home 2 years ago at K-State, and then last year they went into Oklahoma. And I was convinced that was going to be a revenge game where Oklahoma was going to be like, no, you are not getting us again. And Kansas State pulled off the upset on what was a somewhat subpar Oklahoma team until near the end of the season. They just didn't play to Oklahoma standards for much of last season. But K-State got them. This season, I think it's easy to fall into the idea that, well, now this season, Oklahoma's going to think we're going to roll into Manhattan, Kansas, and we're just going to drop a bomb on the Wildcats. However, the very next week is the Red River Showdown against Texas, which, if any game on an Oklahoma schedule has meaning, it's the game against Texas. Even more so than the in-state rivalry against Oklahoma State, the game against Texas just means way more than almost any other game. So maybe Oklahoma finds themselves looking past K-State because they know they got to play Texas the following week. Maybe K-State gets them for a third time. Maybe the third time is the charm for Oklahoma and they finally get K-State and then go on to play Texas. Who knows? But then that Texas game, maybe Oklahoma does the reverse, and maybe they think so much about the K-State game, and they get so excited about winning that game on their opponent's field that they roll into the Cotton Bowl and they get a bomb laid on them by Texas. I don't know. But the Red River Showdown is always a good game. It's always a heated game. It's always very fun to watch. So that's a notable game on October 9th for the Oklahoma Sooners. The biggest challenge they're going to have in competing for the Big 12 championship is Iowa State. A lot of people very high on Iowa State. I like Iowa State. Matt Campbell is a good head coach who's proven he can win games at a place that isn't a powerhouse of recruiting and isn't a name brand. It's not a blue blood program like Oklahoma or Texas. They've got an experienced quarterback in Brock Purdy, who's played some tough games against Oklahoma, almost pulled out some upsets against Oklahoma. That game is at Oklahoma on November 20th. It's the second to last game of the season. So at that point, as my voice cracks, at that point, we could see the two of those teams jockeying for who's going to go to the Big 12 championship game, or that could just be the first game that will then lead to a rematch in a Big 12 championship game. That's also an interesting one because the very next week, Oklahoma's playing the Bedlam game at Oklahoma State. So again, they've got some weird pairings. They really want to get a win against K-State, but the next week they've got Texas. So which game can they focus on one game at a time, or do they get distracted because they're back-to-back? And then same thing at the end of the season with Iowa State at home and then Oklahoma State on the road. Do they get distracted by one of those two games? Have they wrapped up a slot in the Big 12 championship game by that point, and they just take one of those games easy? Who knows? But it's a series of games that I'm looking forward to seeing. Okay, so those are the 5 Power 5 conferences. Let's look at teams that are in my neck of the woods. And we're going to start with the University of Michigan. A lot of games to look at here in their schedule. In the second game of the season, they are home against the Washington Huskies. They had a deal much like Ohio State had, where Michigan last year was supposed to go to Seattle to play Washington, but that game, obviously because of pandemic reasons, was canceled. So now this year, Washington is coming to Ann Arbor to play the Wolverines. Michigan was a horrid team last year. They were a disaster of a team last year. Washington, as I mentioned earlier, was all set to go to the Pac-12 championship game, but a late COVID outbreak removed them from that opportunity. I believe that Washington feels like they have something to prove this season because they didn't get a chance to compete for the Pac-12 title. So that's going to be hopefully a good game on the second week of the season. The first 2 weeks have some good games. Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, Miami, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Washington. Some good games, again, at least on paper, in the first couple of weeks of the season. Michigan's schedule is odd because they're home for the first 4 games of the season. The last of those games is against Rutgers, and it's their homecoming game, which is really odd to me that that game gets labeled homecoming, even though Michigan wouldn't have left Ann Arbor even once before then. Isn't homecoming supposed to be a game that's like at the end of a road streak or something? We're like, hey, we haven't seen our home team in 3 weeks. Now it's homecoming. But no, Michigan's like at the end of a 4-game streak at home. They're going to be like, this is homecoming. And then next week, we'll get to go on the road for the first time. Which, that game, by the way, October 2nd, is at Wisconsin. Wisconsin has been problematic for the Wolverines during the Jim Harbaugh years. And things have not always gone well, especially at Camp Randall in Madison. So that game should be one to watch because Wisconsin got hit with a lot of game cancellations last year because of continuing COVID outbreaks. So I'm not really sure how good Wisconsin even is because last year just wasn't providing enough evidence to determine how good they could possibly be. But that could possibly be a good game on the schedule. Then a few weeks later, Michigan is home against Northwestern. Northwestern has been good and has played Michigan tough. In recent years, Northwestern has gone to a couple of Big Ten championship games in recent years. So that's not necessarily going to be an easy out for the Wolverines, especially if they continue what they were doing last season and just have an absolute lackluster year. Then you've got the big in-state rivalry against Michigan State. That's at East Lansing this time on October 30th. Michigan State got them in Ann Arbor last year under new head coach Mel Tucker in what I think a lot of people thought was a very surprising win for Michigan State and one of the few bright spots in MSU's season, to be perfectly honest. But again, it's a rivalry game. Everybody in the state gets excited about it. They get ramped up about it. So that should be one to note. Then the next week, Michigan is home against Indiana. I've already talked about Indiana earlier in this video, so you know my thoughts on that. If Michigan has a bit of a rebound season and they're either in the mix or potentially in the mix for a Big Ten championship berth, they're probably going to have to deal with Indiana. And again, that game comes right on the heels of the in-state rivalry against Michigan State. So Is Michigan going to be overlooking MSU for the Indiana game and then maybe get bit by MSU? Or are they going to focus so much on MSU that they'll have an emotional letdown and just get housed by Indiana the next week? That's why they play the games, and that's why it's so exciting. But that promises to be a good game, at least on paper. And then lastly, there is the game at home against the main rival, Ohio State. Things haven't gone well for Michigan against Ohio State in the Jim Harbaugh era. He is 0-5 against Ohio State in his 6 years. The game against the Buckeyes got canceled last season due to an outbreak of COVID in Ann Arbor among the players. So some might argue that Harbaugh is a bit lucky that he didn't go 0-6. He is the first Michigan head coach to go 0-5 against the main rival in Ohio State. And other than I think it was the over or double overtime game that Ohio State won, most of these games haven't even been close, unfortunately. So Michigan better hope that they have a rebound season, and they better hope that some of the new players, some of the new starters for Ohio State take a lot of time to get their feet underneath them, or else that might end up being another disastrous game. And then finally, there is the Michigan State Spartans, who again, last few seasons have just been sorely disappointing. The last few seasons under Mark D'Antonio were disappointing. The first season under Mel Tucker was, I don't want to say disappointing, because I don't think anybody really had high hopes for Mel Tucker's first season, especially if you were paying attention to MSU football and noticing all of the players leaving through the transfer portal. I don't think anyone was really expecting that he was going to go like 10-2 for the season. And then the pandemic hit, and then the season got shortened up. But I don't think anyone was even expecting that Michigan State was going to be that good last year, and they weren't. They had the big win against Michigan, which is a feather in Tucker's cap, but other than that, kind of a forgettable season. This coming year, their schedule's a bit awkward because they're starting out with a Big Ten opponent right off the bat. So no easing their way into the schedule with like a Division II opponent or a Group of 5 opponent. No. They're starting on the road against Northwestern on September 4th, which I don't think bodes well. Because again, I just talked about Northwestern. They've played Michigan State very tough. They've beaten them a few times in the last few years. I don't picture that being a real good start for MSU's season, nor do I picture it being a good omen for MSU's season this year either. And it doesn't get any easier, because 2 weeks later, they're at Miami. So they're traveling down to Miami, Florida to play the Hurricanes in the third week of the season. So this is not boding well for the Spartans at all. And then a few weeks later, they're at Indiana. I've already said a bunch about Indiana. You're sick of hearing about Indiana. Then 2 weeks later, they're home for the game against U of M, the big in-state rivalry game. I talked about that a moment ago. And then they end the season at Ohio State on November 20th, and then home versus Penn State on November 27th. Now, that Ohio State matchup is potentially interesting because the very next week, as I was just mentioning, Ohio State goes on the road to play their main rival, the University of Michigan. If MSU's not having a stellar season, could they find themselves in a situation where Ohio State is just completely disregarding them and looking forward to the final week of the season and perhaps a berth in a Big Ten championship game? And could that mean MSU could play out of their mind football and knock off the Buckeyes? I don't know. We'll see what happens. But those are 7 schedules for 7 teams with a number of, at least on paper, important games or potentially intriguing matchups that I think we will see during the 2021 college football season. Thank you all so much for tuning into this video. Hopefully, I'll be able to get back on track with making these videos as we go forward throughout the summer and get into things like the AP Top 25, which I'm looking forward to when they're going to release that preseason poll. I have not seen the AP release one yet. I saw one for USA Today, but I'd rather wait for the official AP preseason poll to tell you why preseason polls are absolute dumpster fires and why they need to go away. I'm looking forward to having some time now that it's summer to do some research into the financials of college football, to start looking into some of that stuff. So hopefully I'll be able to get back on track. And then especially when we get to the fall and we get to August and we get into September, I can get back into my weekly predictions for the top 25 games. Because I didn't do that this past season because of everything going on with the pandemic and all the associated problems with the pandemic. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope to see you again for future videos as I put them up. Pay attention to my YouTube channel. Be sure to like this video. Be sure to share this video with others who you know are fans of the college football. And be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks, everybody.